In this video, I'm going to discuss some very common mistakes beginning artists make when drawing the head, and then show you simple ways of correcting them. As a professor of art specializing in figure drawing, I often encounter these errors in the classroom, and after 16 years of teaching, have developed ways of getting my students to stop making them. I realize that there are a lot of high-quality drawing instruction videos on YouTube, and this is an extremely crowded space, but I feel my approach is somewhat unique and can actually improve your drawings in a relatively short span of time, so I've decided to share it. The problem with drawing errors is that we often can't tell that we're making them even if they're pointed out to us many times. This is because these errors are deeply rooted in the way we interpret and prioritize what we see. When it comes to drawing the face, we instinctually focus on the details of the eyes, the nose, the mouth, independent of the rest of the face and head. A great example of this is what's called the Thatcher effect. If you look at this image of an upside-down Mona Lisa, you might not notice anything wrong with it until you rotate the image right side up and realize that the Mona Lisa just smelled something horrible. In all seriousness, the focus on details at the expense of the larger whole is what usually leads to drawing errors. And a big part of learning to draw correctly is training oneself to think about the larger structures of the head before delving into the details of the eyes, the nose, the mouth. Okay, let's begin with the top 6 greatest hits of drawing errors in no particular order. In order to remember them better, I've given them names, and the name of the first one is the Kermit, after Kermit the Frog. Here's a student drawing with the Kermit mistake. The hair is obscuring the scalp, but let's estimate where it is. Let's say right about here, which doesn't give nearly enough space for the top of the head and the forehead. Since the eyes are always at about the middle of the head, whatever distance I have from this line to the chin will be the same as from this line to the top of the head. So if the top of the head is here now, the hair will sit on top. In this drawing, I deliberately made the Kermit mistake. The check for it is very simple. I take a measurement from the middle of the eye to the chin, and then compare it with the distance between the middle of the eye and the top of the head. Once I've determined where the top of the head needs to be, I lift everything up. I'll list the materials I'm using at the end of the video, but in short, I'm using a technique called charcoal reduction, which allows me to quickly and easily fix my mistakes. I strongly recommend when learning to draw that you use this technique or something similar, since it allows the maximum flexibility to make corrections at whatever stage your drawing is in. Ideally, of course, it's best not to make this mistake in the first place, and the way to do this is to sketch in the overall shape of the head. In my method, I simply use an oval, and then draw a line through the center. On most people, the eyes are going to sit on that line, and if they don't, you'll always be able to add a little bit of space on the chin or on the scalp, depending on who you're looking at. So, by quickly indicating your eye level at the beginning, you ensure that you're drawing a head with human proportions and not Miss Piggy's boyfriend. The second mistake is not adding enough space to the back of the head. This is what I call the Beavis, after my 2 favorite animated delinquents, Beavis and Butthead. As with the Kermit, the Beavis is also easily corrected. All you have to do is measure the width of the head by holding your arm straight and your pencil horizontal. Close one eye and move your pencil until the tip lines up with the forehead, and then slide your thumb back and forth until your thumbnail lines up with the back of the head. With hair, this will have to be an educated guess, since you can't really see the back of the head, but you'll get close enough. Once you have a measurement of the width of the head, keep your thumb in the same place and rotate your pencil vertically. Then, move your arm so that the thumbnail lines up with the chin. When I do that, I realize that the tip of my pencil lines up with the top of the forehead. Now all I need to do is find that distance in my drawing using my hands, and then use it to find the correct depth. Though correcting this mistake usually requires the addition of a little bit of hair, it's best to avoid this problem from the very beginning instead of noticing it and correcting it later. You should always practice getting things right the first time, since you might eventually use a technique that is not so easily correctable. When starting my drawing, as soon as I've sketched in my facial features, I'll do the measurements I just showed you, and then roughly sketch in the back of the head based on those measurements. By the way, don't assume that the width of the head will always run to the top of the forehead. The proportions of the head vary depending on the model and the rotation, so always make that measurement as early as possible to avoid doing a drawing that looks like this guy. The third very common mistake is placing the eyes too close together. I'm not really sure why this mistake happens, but it's always with the eyes too close and almost never too far apart. This one can be very frustrating because it's not easily corrected and can really ruin a drawing. Furthermore, placing the eyes exactly in the right spot can be a game of millimeters, requiring quite a bit of accuracy. To better remember this mistake, we're going to call it the Cartman. One way to fix this problem is to think about the third eye. No, we're not talking about some mystical appendage. It's simply a way to remember that there is usually a width equivalent to one eye between the eyes. This, of course, assumes that you drew the eyes the correct width in the first place. Another way of placing the eyes is to remember this very simple rule. Where the nostrils end, the eyes begin. Meaning, if you sketch in a line from the nostrils, that line will usually line up with the inside corners of the eyes. While you can't always see the back nostrils, it will help you place the closer eye, and then you can use the third eye rule to make sure that the back eye is in the right spot. Here's my own drawing with this unfortunate error. By thinking about the location of the third eye in my subject, it makes it easier to locate the actual position of the eye in my drawing. The distance between the eyes will vary depending on the person, sometimes wider apart or sometimes closer together, but no one has eyes growing from the side of their nose. I'm also using the nostril trick to get my eye placement, checking to see where the inside corner of the eye lines up against the nostril. Never rely on any one measurement to get your placement. Using a few different sources of information will get you a much more accurate result. The fourth common mistake is relying too much on lines to draw the facial features. The forms in the face are complex and better drawn with value. Unless you're cartooning, the less lines you use, the more realistic the effect will be. This doesn't mean that you should avoid lines altogether, but use them sparingly. This mistake I call the Picasso. Of course, Picasso's use of strong outlines is deliberate, but if your intention is to draw realistically, these types of hard lines should be avoided. Instead of placing sharp outlines in the eye, you'll get a more realistic effect if you introduce a little bit of shading underneath the upper eyelid, a little bit of shading underneath the lower eyelid, essentially drawing everything with fuzzy shadows instead of lines. Toward the end of the drawing, you can put in a few delicate lines here and there, but be very selective and only show sharpness where you actually see it. As for eyelashes, my advice is not to draw them in detail, since even from a slight distance, you don't really see individual hairs. Instead, I suggest the presence of lashes by introducing a fuzzy dark shadow under the upper eyelid. From a distance, this will look like lashes to the viewer. The lesson here is sometimes the suggestion of detail is better than the detail itself. As for the lower eyelashes, here is my advice. Don't draw them. When drawing the mouth, it's also good practice to avoid lines. The transition from skin to lip should be gradual instead of sharp, and really the only place you should be putting lines is where the lips are touching, and even then, selectively. As with the eye, many people have problems drawing mouths because they have a very strong mental image of what a mouth looks like. By only using shading when you draw and focusing on value, it makes it easier to push past what you think you should be seeing and draw what you actually see. The same principle applies to noses. Instead of using line to indicate the shape, try using only shading until the very, very last step. This is particularly important when drawing a nose in 3/4 view. If you place a really sharp line at the top of the nose, it'll flatten out the form, making the nose look like it's in profile. So, in short, the fix to the Picasso mistake can be summarized like this. If you don't see lines, don't draw any. Unless, of course, you're Picasso. Then draw however and whatever you want. The fifth very common mistake is making the hair look flat by focusing on the texture at the expense of form. This happens for the same reason why other mistakes happen, because we tend to draw detail first. Here's a student example of this mistake. The head itself is nicely drawn, a little too linear in the facial features, but still with a strong sense of form. When it comes to the hair, however, this student diligently put in lots and lots of hair texture, but forgot about the round shape underneath, making that area look entirely flat. This mistake we'll call the Linus, after the Peanuts character. Here's a drawing I did with the Linus mistake. The fix here is to memorize this acronym, VFT, which stands for Value, Form, and Texture. That is the order in which you should draw things. When shading an object, the first thing to think about is its value. If the hair is darker than the skin tone, the first step is to shade the entire thing down to its average value. Once you've thought about the value, it's time to think about the form. Ask yourself, where is the hair generally light and where is it generally in shadow? Pretend like the hair is made of a solid material and give it a shape. Then look for smaller shapes within that shape formed by large bundles of hair. Only once the hair looks three-dimensional do you start applying the hair texture. However, avoid making that texture evenly strong everywhere. The hair should be more strongly textured where it's closer to the viewer and softer towards the sides where it's further away. Though this might not be the way we actually see the hair, exaggerating the contrast between where the hair is close and where it's further away will accentuate the sense of form, preventing the Linus error. Before talking about the last mistake, here are the materials I used in this tutorial. This is charcoal powder. I apply it to white drawing paper using a chamois cloth, giving the paper a light gray tone. This allows me to work in both directions, meaning that I can go darker with my pencils and then use erasers to go lighter, which allows me to establish the correct values more quickly. It's also a very flexible, correctable technique that's great for beginning artists. I'm using a Wolff's carbon pencil to do my drawing. These pencils come in a range of softnesses, and I'm using the 6B, the softest one available. To erase, I'm using a kneaded eraser and a hard white nylon eraser, as well as a few eraser holders that allow me to erase little details. I'm doing most of my blending with stumps, and for larger areas, a heavy-duty paper towel, and then, for making corrections, a chamois cloth. I'm also using a white chalk pencil to add a little more pop to my brightest highlights. Drawing the head is one of the more difficult things an artist is required to do, and there are many more common mistakes one can make. But we have to start somewhere, and by correcting these common errors, you will make a big leap in your proficiency at head drawing. A big part of drawing falls under the adage, know thyself. This means knowing what drawing mistakes you tend to make and keeping an eye out for them. Over time, if you're diligent, you'll find yourself making these mistakes less and less, but they're still bound to happen on occasion. My most common mistake is putting the eyes in the wrong place, and I never trust myself to get it right the first time, always checking and rechecking for mistakes. Of course, it's not enough just to know what mistakes to avoid. To get really good at head drawing, it's important to learn a system for constructing the head and use it every time you draw. There are many approaches, and I'm not going to recommend one over the other, but all of them have one thing in common. They break things down into simple steps, making you work big to small, establishing the overall proportions of the head and the location of the facial features before putting in the details. So, in case you were wondering what happened to the sixth mistake, here it is. The biggest and most common mistake people make when drawing the head is not following a system, but simply starting in one spot, such as the eye or the nose, and working their way out. This mistake doesn't have a name, so let's just call him Bob. I hope you found this video useful. If you'd like to know more about my system of drawing the head, I have quite a few tutorials on head drawing in my head drawing playlist for you. My plan is to expand the scope of my channel with many more drawing tutorials for the general public, so if you like this video, please subscribe and stay tuned. Thanks for watching, and as always, if you have questions or comments, leave them below, and I'll be happy to respond.